All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. I realize we're starting precisely at 1, so people may still be hopping on the phone or joining us in the room in the next few minutes, and that's fine. Thank you all for being here. Last time we had agreed that we were going to work on some language to enshrine the independence of the Office of the Public Records Advocate. So we're going to talk about that today, and we're also going to talk about hiring for the new Public Records Advocate. So before we get started, if folks who could go ahead and introduce themselves, I'll start with folks in the room, and then I'll go to council members on the phone. And just as an organizational note, we will be accepting public comment in the room throughout the meeting. So if you're here in the room and you'd like to comment, feel free to step up to the table. If you're on the phone, that gets a little bit trickier. So we're going to set aside some phone comment times just so people aren't tripping over each other. So we'll make sure that we go to the phone for comment. So we do have some time set aside for that. But we'll start right now by just doing introductions. I'm Ginger McCall, the Public Records Advocate and Chair of this council.
Rich Vial, Deputy Secretary of State.
Scott Winkles with the League of Oregon.
Rob Levette, Association of Oregon Counties.
Steve Suo from the Oregonian and Society of Professional Journalists.
Okay. Other non-council members in the room want to introduce themselves?
Stephanie Clark, State Archivist.
Chris Benson, Manager of Records Management Unit, Florida State Archives.
Todd Albert, Deputy Public Records Advocate.
Claire Wiscombe from the East Oregonian.
All right, let's go ahead and go to the phone. Council members on the phone, could you please introduce yourself?
This is Les.
Okay, I hear Les and Michael.
No,
Yeah,
Michael Crone, Mark Landauer.
Oh, I'm sorry, Mark. Okay, so I hear Les and Mark on the phone. Do we have any other council members on the phone?
You do have Michael Crone. I just keep talking at the same time as other people.
All right, perfect. So I have Les, Mark, and Michael on the phone. That's good. That gets us a quorum. I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. Thatcher. Oh, Senator Thatcher. Thank you. All right. Anyone else on the phone? Council members. Any other folks on the phone that would like to introduce themselves?
Yes, Brittany Ruiz here, Parental Rights Advocate.
Okay. Anybody else?
Bernie Graham with SEIU.
Okay.
Boaz Dillon, Freedom Foundation.
Teresa Bottomley, the Oregonian, Open Oregon.
Okay.
And also Hillary Borud here from the Oregonian.
All right, thank you, Hillary. Okay. All right. And again, for folks on the phone, we will set aside comment time if you'd like to comment. For folks in the room, if you want to step up to the table with anything, just let us know. So our first item on the agenda is to discuss the legislative proposal to enshrine independence of the advocate. Just as a reminder, in our last meeting, we agreed that we were going to put together legislation that would enshrine the independence of the advocate in the statute to the maximum extent allowable under the Oregon Constitution. So as I counted, we have 3 proposals before us. We have Rob's proposal, my proposal, and then a compromise proposal that Les had put together. So I think perhaps it would be helpful for us to just kind of talk for a little while about the aspects of these proposals that we feel particularly strongly about, what we think would be necessary to have in a legislative proposal that would actually enshrine the independence of the office. So I will open the floor to that conversation.
I've got a preliminary question. This is Rich Vial. Do we have a legislator that has indicated willingness to request, draft, and introduce a proposed bill?
I think we have 2.
Do we?
Yeah. I think, Senator Thatcher, I believe you're on the line. Could you speak to that? Could you hear the question?
Yes, I have to get it off mute. I believe there's a committee bill that would be reserved for this in another place in the Senate side.
That's excellent news.
Okay.
And this is Representative Karin Powerstar, a few minutes late jumping on.
Great, thank you, Representative Power. Okay, so it sounds like we do have a committee bill that will allow for the introduction of the legislation here. We also have a commitment from the governor in her public statements that she is going to support it. So I think we have, pretty strong momentum here. We just need to agree to what we want to have in that legislation. So do folks want to speak to that?
Should I start?
Sure.
Might as well. And then, because I think what happened mechanically was I submitted my first draft and then people took it, added to, subtract from, and then I did my second draft, which started from the first draft, and then people added to and so I'll start with my first draft and explain my logic in it. But I guess I should start with this, which is, I think, a political reality check for all of us. I don't think technically legislation is even necessary, but I'm not pushing for us not to do legislation. I think it's not necessary for this basic reason. I don't think any governor in the foreseeable future will ever go down this path again, politically. And I think that's just true. But there will come a time at which this all fades and someone could go down this path again. So I think we ought to do legislation. So then my take on drafting the legislation was to try to, quite frankly, write it the way I would have written it in 2017 out of a nest, which is basically use the existing model we have. And the existing model we have has existed since 1933. And it basically is creating independence for the head of a state agency by making them work for and be hired by and answer to a commission or a board, a council in this case, that is appointed by the governor, creating insulation. We do that on the Ethics Commission more recently, and we've done that in the Oregon Liquor Control Commission setting as well. And so that's the core of the language and structure that I propose. And the reason I propose sticking with that is my concerns about reaching too far in creating an unconstitutional separation of powers problem. Because the Oregon Constitution basically says the governor is the head of the executive branch. And while we haven't had, to my knowledge, direct challenges to the 1933 model, I think it's probably the cleanest model that won't create separation of powers issues. If we create an independent advocate that is also somewhat independent from the council itself, then I worry about potential challenges to that structure. And I don't know that we need to push that far. So I basically just went with the existing model. That would mean the council hires the advocate. The governor still appoints the council under the term limits, subject to Senate confirmation and all of that. But we basically convert to an ethics commission style of model, and that's what I would promote. Now, in my second draft, I did change a couple of things that occurred to me we have to change or we ought to change if we go with that model. The first is, unlike the Ethics Commission and OLCC, I think we need specific language acknowledging that the council can operate in terms of promoting legislation separately from the governor's office. The OLCC and the Ethics Commission don't have that power. Currently, they have to go through the governor's office for legislation. So I crafted a subsection 11 that I propose to tack on to the bottom of the council statute that would acknowledge that. It does not attempt to change legislative process or priorities or any of the House rules or Senate rules. It just says we can go to representatives, we can go to senators with things that we agree upon here and get them to introduce it. That's all it says. So if the House prohibits us from doing that, that's their business. If the House sets rules limiting what people can do, that's their business. And I don't want to try to create a separation of powers problem with the legislature. So that would be the notion of tacking on the subsection 11. The other change I made to my first draft that I thought we ought to make as a practical matter, otherwise it would create a model that's just weird. Right now, under our current model, the advocate is the chair of the council, which I'm totally good with. But I think if we convert to the other model, that would create some awkwardness in the sense that, let's say hypothetically, the council is not pleased with the performance of the advocate. I'm not saying that will happen, but theoretically it could. But the advocate is chair of the council. It just creates awkwardness, and I think that's why that's not baked into the Ethics Commission or into the OLCC model, in which the directors of those two state agencies don't even sit on the council or commission to which hire them. Now, I'm not proposing that. I'm proposing we leave the advocate on the council, but I think the chair ought to be rotated, the normal process, and so I simply lifted the language out of the Ethics Commission statute and inserted it into Section 1. But those are the substantive changes I made from my draft 1. And then I'll stop talking, because I know there are other ideas about attacking this thing from different ways, but that's my take on it, and I'll stop talking.
Can I start by asking you a question before we talk about others? So in terms of the separation of powers issue, is that accomplished largely by making the advocate an appointee of the council and removal at the discretion of the council?
Yes, because that's the model we have elsewhere. Here, I'll just lay it out. What I see as a potential challenge under the Oregon Constitution. If we create an independent actor that looks not only completely independent from the governor's office, but maybe even independent to some degree from the council itself, we have created a pocket of the executive department that is not responsible to a statewide elected official directly under the Oregon Constitution. And so I think we can build a layer of insulation by having the governor appoint the council and the council hire the advocate. And that's a structure that's pretty well known and I think accepted. It's not breaching that separation of powers. But if we truly create an independent actor, I think that might raise issues, and I don't think it's necessary issues.
So do you think it's essential to that oversight to have the advocate be subject to policy direction by the council?
Not necessarily. You can pull that out. You can pull any of this stuff out.
Is it essential that the advocate be serving at the pleasure and not dismissible for cause?
You know, I don't know that it's necessary. I think we could do it for cause. That's just not the model we have anywhere else. And if you create supermajorities required to take action or heightened levels of disciplinary, I worry about challenges based on insulating folks from the process. Because what you're basically asking the legislature to do, and what we want to be careful not to do, is to ask the legislature to carve out a piece of the executive branch and keep it out of reach of the governor. I think if you do that, intending to do that, and if the legislature does that, intending to do that, we're just going to see a legal challenge.
In order to keep it from, in order to preserve some manner of accountability or some chain of accountability, could you make it for cause, but also set a term limit as exists in current statute? So it would force the issue every 4 years.
Oh, every 4 years, so the council has to re-up.
Yeah.
Yeah, that might provide some insulation. I think that's entirely possible as well as an option.
Yeah, I mean, I like that option. I will say, just from my personal experience as the advocate, it's a really difficult position and requires balancing a lot of often conflicting interests. And I think it would be difficult to be in that position with the fear of being dismissed just at the pleasure of the board for displeasing. Because, I mean, kind of inherently, this council is made up by design of people with very divergent interests at times. So that kind of could create a position for the advocate where the advocate is trying to please one faction of the council and at the price of, you know, the other opposing faction, and that could be a very difficult thing to balance. So I think a 4-year term limit is a really good idea, because then the council, if they don't like the direction this person is going after 4 years, you know, kick them out, pick someone new.
So put in for cause and a 4-year review, essentially.
I think so. And that was part of Les's proposal, and I like that. But I really like the idea that you had at the end, where you add in that the council can expressly go to the legislature to find someone to introduce. I think that that's essential here.
And I think that's only a matter of executive department policy. Essentially, we kind of went around that policy. But
yeah, and we kind of ended up in an awkward position because we originally had started off with the Secretary of State's office setting and submitting the legislation for us. And then, you know, by the time it came around to fall, we were sort of in a strange place.
It was a strange place. And I know it was really awkward. I know you talked to Scott and me about the process and various things. And it was awkward because when we're dealing with executive stuff like that, it's
Yeah.
normally through the governor's office and their policy advisors, and this is different. And so I think it's important to put that in statute. Otherwise, I worry about people challenging that even.
Yeah, I think that's a really good idea, because I did feel like I was kind of in an awkward place,
Yeah.
Going and shopping for someone to introduce our legislation. I felt like I was duty bound to do that because I'm supposed to zealously represent the council's interests.
Yeah.
And at the same time, it was sort of a strange place for me to be in. And that wasn't even a case where it was by virtue of the fact that the governor's office didn't want to, introduce our legislation. It was just by virtue of the timing.
Yeah.
Because when I got here, it was already late April and the timetable had passed, so.
Now, if I can make another political comment, because I'm feeling like I'm unfiltered these days, for reasons I won't get into. But the reality is, we're talking 2020. The oxygen in the room in 2020 is going to be consumed by cap and trade. And why I say that is because that doesn't mean they're not going to do a lot of other stuff. And I assure you, they will do a lot of other stuff during the short session. It's just a lot of the policy and politics will be focused on that and won't be focused necessarily on this. So one of my questions, and that's really for two of the people on the phone, but maybe not to answer now because, they may or may want to talk about it now, but what is the political reality in the building? What is the legislature willing to actually put in statute? Because we're all assuming, for the sake of argument, that they're just going to take what we draft and agree upon and pass. And I think that's maybe a rash assumption. So, and again, that's why I would urge us to be surgical and not reach too far, because I think if we reach too far, may run into reticence, but maybe I'm mistaken on that.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Do either of our, the senator or representative on the phone want to speak to whether or not you have a sense of what the sentiment in the building is about this?
I think there's always a lot on the table for short sessions, but it's much less of a workload than in a long session because of bill limits and committee bill limits. I wouldn't withhold from moving ahead with a piece of legislation if the council landed on a consensus draft. We appear to have a designated position available, or a designated spot available on the Senate side committee. And, there's never any guarantee that a bill will pass, but there will be a number of big things, I'm sure, forthcoming, not just a cap and trade concept, but that's my take. I wouldn't want to put a pause on any kind of a conversation that the council wanted just because we only meet for 5 weeks versus a long session. Senator Thatcher, did you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, sorry, finally got unmuted, I think. Yeah, I would agree that as long as we're not reaching too far and that it's consensus, that there shouldn't be a problem passing it.
May I ask just one more question of Rob, and then I'll stop asking questions. But I do think
it's his job. He has practice at asking me questions. They're calling bullshit on me too. I know.
I've actually interviewed Rob many times. So I noticed that your draft did not include a line that was in Ginger's draft, that just explicitly stating that the office is created as an independent body from any governmental agency. Is that a deliberate omission, or would you be amenable to that?
I'm amenable to that, but I would want to know what you think that gains us, because I don't think it does. And I would want to avoid raising unnecessary red flags. If you think that actually accomplishes something that the rest of the draft doesn't, then I'd want to know what that is. But I'm definitely amenable to it. I just don't know what it does.
And I'm curious as to what it would mean. I can see that being interpreted to be carried to an extreme in certain circumstances that could ultimately result in litigation that we probably don't need if we're careful about stating just how much independent. For example, under our current budgeting system, there's no way we're going to be completely independent of the LFO budgeting system.
Right.
And so if we say independent of all other government agencies, potentially.
Sure. The way other states have handled that, and presumably they have same constitutional separation of powers issues that we do. For children's ombudsman, this explicit language exists in their statutes stating that the ombudsman is independent of any government agency. But it also states, for instance, under Georgia law, that for administrative purposes, the ombudsman may be conjoined with another state agency, but that shall not infringe upon the autonomy of the agency. So, of course, Ginger's office is now attached to DAS COO budget, I believe.
Yes, yeah.
And so that would be allowable, but you just make clear that that does not imply a chain of reporting.
Yeah, and that was language that I had listed from the long-term care ombudsman's office here. Todd, I don't know if you recall anything more about that conversation we had with them, if they talked about that language specifically. I feel like that language was the result of a similar political battle to the situation that we're in now.
Yeah, it occurred several years after their creation. Their statute was amended to include that language, and I think it was intended to do so to explicitly state its administrative independence, kind of along the lines that Steve just laid out, that it may exist within a framework of other agencies, services, interactions, but that for its policy making and daily work provisions, it's separate of all other agencies that could do that work autonomously. I just want to mention that the Colorado Child Protection Ombudsman, or an office similar title, has gone through these issues and has a similar statute that also lays out that it is independent while it can exist administratively intertwined with other agencies as well. So maybe it's just a question of fleshing it out in our statute, even beyond what the long-term care ombudsman statute says, to get to the full point.
And I think part of that also is tied to public perception of the office. You know, if the public is engaging in mediation or an ombuds function with the office, the perception of whether or not the office is independent might be important there.
I mean, clearly, at least one trained attorney read the existing statute and saw a line of reporting from the governor's office to.
And I agree, but I see that functionally different than what we've got here. And this is why. I believe there is a component part of what the advocate does that looks like what you could otherwise call an inspector general or an ombudsman. Someone who is acting independent from the agency to some degree, so they can essentially, to be honest, point out where the agency is failing. I mean, we have those all over the place, even in the state government. And that's one thing. I think we could write around that piece of it, maybe, if we thought it necessary. I don't think it's necessary, but I haven't heard why it's necessary. But the other aspect of what the advocate does is participate in this council, promote legislation, promote policy in the building. That's a big deal. And I'm not saying that ombudsmen and inspector general isn't a big deal, but that's a big deal internal to the agency itself. This is something different. This is, to my mind, really carving out a piece of the executive department and putting it out on its own to some extent. So, and to an extent, the Ethics Commission behaves in ways, although not with legislation, but they actually do things that are divorced from the governor's office intentionally for the same type of reason, that goes beyond an ombudsman function, that goes beyond an inspector general function, because the Ethics Commission director is not there to, well, is in part there to point out where the commission is failing, but that's not his role. I mean, his primary role is to help drive ethics policy and ethics law and interpretation and application of ethics law to government officials. And OLCC, you know, engages in all kinds of stuff that isn't really all about internally looking, but is external. And so I view this fundamentally different. If you can point to an example in Oregon, quite frankly, in any other state, where you have an executive department policy person, not an inspector or someone trying to solve internal problems, but is actually driving policy. If you can show me an executive level policy driver from another state, or especially in Oregon, I'd love to see it, but I'm not aware of it.
Well, I think the child ombudsman's office fill that, to fit that description. I mean, they don't exist simply to, you know, mediate disputes or bring complaints to the attention of the department. They exist to recommend systemic change to child welfare programs throughout the country, various states in the country. And they do have these protections, explicit independent autonomy written in statute.
This is Les. Can I chime in here?
Sure.
So, been listening to the conversation, and I don't have all the constitutional scholarly background of my esteemed friend from the Counties Association, but as I've looked at these different proposals, and the reason I suggested some compromise language this morning is that I've been sort of driven by the primary issue of how do we assure and provide for the independence of the advocate. And this isn't just an issue for the council. I think the public in a variety of forms has made it very clear that it expects and it wants the public records advocate to be independent. So while we have to defer to legislative will, I think we also have to be attentive to public will and as we look at these reforms. And so as I've looked at this language, I've looked at what is in here that would provide protection from undue influence and rebuff unnecessary pressure to allow the advocate to perform the duty. And the second tier is what is the role of the council if we do make the changes and who reports to whom. And it seems to me that we can get there as a body in a couple of ways. In my proposal, and I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a legislative drafter, but it seemed to me that we do have to make pretty explicit the intent of the independence of this, and that's why under Section 1 I simply added the word independent. So we say that the independent office of public records advocate is created. That is a political statement as much as a legal statement, but it makes clear to the public, to legislators, to people in government that this is considered to be an independent operation. And I think there are ways that we can modify the language, Rob, and I assume draft 2 is your latest version. Is that right, Rob?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So in my rough revision, I made some revisions to your Section 2, but I think that we can compress that even more. And I think the language of having a set term plus removal for cause provides again that protections, sort of a protective cocoon around the advocate without leaving the advocate completely untouchable. And so that's why I suggested adopting Ginger's language for a 4-year term with removal otherwise for cause, and removing the language about serving at discretion, because I just think that leaves too much at risk for undue influence and pressure.
Hello, this is Mark Landauer, and just on the face of it, it seems to me that we want to be able to attract very qualified individuals, and in that regard and along that vein, I tend to agree with Les here that we want to provide a 4-year term that gives at least some stability or a sense of stability to the position. I think that having gone through our recent experience, it would behoove us to include that language. And so I just wanted to share that perspective as well.
Thank you, Mark. Yeah, I want to agree with that. I mean, as someone who picked up and moved across the country for this position, I don't think that we will be able to attract any kind of out-of-state candidates or do a national search if there isn't at least some kind of protection there, because of the history of kind of fraught politics with this position. I think that offering that protection would probably allow for us to be able to attract more candidates.
It sounds like there's some degree.
Are we at a point to move forward with some language? Rob, are you open to amendments to your draft? How do we want to proceed?
Oh, yeah. I mean, just as I'm open to any of these suggestions, You know, I'm just going to be one that's pushing us to be more surgical consistently, because I don't want, I get the idea of making a political statement in this bill. I get that. I'm just going to be trying to avoid that, because that's just my job. I just try to avoid political statements in legislation. But I get it, and I'll support it, whatever this council wants to do.
And I would, this is Mark Landauer. I'd echo Rob's sentiments there. Thank you.
My position on this has not fundamentally changed since the last. Did you meet last week? I was out.
No, we didn't. We didn't have a quorum. Or
not
a quorum.
I think we should think long and hard about separating this office from giving this office independence, particularly from the governor's office. I understand that the situation and the perspective that have been offered. However, I think you're in a situation of submitting bills to the legislature without coordination with the other agencies. Fiscals will be put on them, will be separated from the governor's agenda. And I'm not convinced this is the best way to go at this time. There might be some things that will make me dislike it less, but I can't see moving forward with this structure at this time. So,
Scott, what specific scenarios do you see playing out with that lack of reporting to the governor?
Well, it's not so much, it has more to do with the way the governor and the state agencies pursue legislation. So the other agencies, OLCC, OGEC, where they have the independence, which I've actually argued against that structure previously in other venues for other reasons. Goes to the legislative director, court brings the state's legislative agencies together, and there's a coordinated agenda. So nobody gets, so if OLCC is doing something that Health and Human Services or the public health officer doesn't like, there's an opportunity to vet and resolve that issue, and that probably happens quite frequently. We're not, and in this scenario, that's not going to happen. The bill will be submitted, and it will be up to the advocate to essentially lobby them independent without any assistance of the governor's office. And so in the scenario we had this session with the reporting bill, when the fiscal was issued, there would not be a means, because we're saying that there can't be interference, there will not be a means to resolve that fiscal through that process with the agencies, and those are going to die.
Well, couldn't there still be support services provided by DAS and so forth? I don't think independence means that you take that away, does it?
Or the advocate could still meet with the relevant agencies. I mean, this council is a vetting body. Staff is represented on this council. The governor's office, by extension, is represented on this council. I mean, and I had this conversation, this was one of the conversations I had with Nisha. Staff could have stepped up on this council at any time and said, hey, we think that this is going to have a fiscal assessment. We should be aware of that. Their representative didn't say that to us.
No, HHS did.
DHS did,
No,
yeah.
DHS did.
Fiscal assessment, which they later removed.
Right.
But there was nothing to stop the advocate or the council from still having conversations with agencies about fiscal assessments.
There's not, but the agencies aren't going to, will take a position on a bill based only at the direction of the legislative director, governor's legislative director, the governor. This model says it's hands off.
So
you're asking, because when we say independence, you're also, we're independent, and
you're saying it weakens the office.
I think it does. I think it may, and I think it will at some point.
I think in some ways running the legislation through, especially given the public records litigation over the legislative proposals that were submitted to the governor's office, I think in some ways this council running its legislation through the governor's process is actually less transparent than if we just submit the legislation, and if agencies want to slap a fiscal on it, that's fine, but at least they're accountable to the public for that.
Right.
But that's the difference. If you run it through the legislative proposals process with the governor's office, that process is a totally not transparent process.
Yeah. I mean, the flip side.
Agencies can kill it in a quiet backroom deal. If they want to kill a piece of transparency legislation, they should have to come out and do that on OLA.
I guess the flip side of what you're saying, Scott, is that the lack of coordination. I get what you're saying. The lack of coordination means that the advocate should be free to be at odds with the governor's agenda. I mean, the advocate is serving the interests of the general public, as is the governor, but as this particular person in this office sees, the improvements that are needed in public records law, with the guidance of this council or the discussions by this council, input from this council, that should be on the table, the ability to independently submit legislation. That's how I think it. Unlike OLCC or ODOT, which is, purely an administrative body that is, providing services to the public. This is an advocate. This is somebody who is independently coming up with conclusions and ideas.
Well, OLCC is also a hearings board where they impose fines and license suspensions, and as is the other agency where this is done, it's OGC, where they're getting complaints and for violations of law or rule. So I think that is a distinction. I know I'm in the minority. I think if we wanted to craft something that provided some statutory protection against undue influence and make some definitions as to what we mean, I think that's probably an area I'd be willing to go.
What if we break this down into kind of concepts? Yeah. I mean, I've written down kind of what we say about the word independence on its own.
Yeah, do we include that? Either, I know Leslie's proposal says independent office. Mine has longer language that was just stolen from the long-term care ombuds statute, but I mean, I'm happy to yield to Leslie's more succinct.
Yeah. Then we've got who appoints, who removes, how to remove, on what basis, how the chair is selected, and whether there's a term limit. They're all a little bit interrelated, but.
I wonder, this is Michael Crone, I wonder if we might also talk about how the governor makes appointments, assuming the governor is going to make all the, or most, I guess, of the appointments. I would point out that the Sunshine Committee, which in many ways overlaps with this body and which I am happy to be the chair of, is a body that is largely actually appointed by the Attorney General and not by the governor. And I wonder if thinking about maybe dividing up some of the board appointments might be a way to maybe create a little more independence without having to go too far afield. Another option, I know, Rob, you mentioned the Ethics Commission a number of times, and Scott, you brought up the Ethics Commission, and maybe that you have some issues with the way that the commission is created. But in that case, the governor makes the appointments, but the pool of people whom the governor is choosing from is determined by legislative leadership almost entirely. I think it's like 8 out of 9 come from House and House and Senate Democratic and Republican leaders. So we could add maybe the question of who appoints the council members as a way of thinking about insulating the advocate's office from pressure.
But if we do these other things, such as making it the appointment by the council, wouldn't you still, Rob, would you still need, would what Michael's proposing, that undermine the, the executive power issue?
I don't think it raises that issue, Steve, but I think I think we ought to talk about it. I think it'd be on the punch list. But my gut reaction, Michael, is to not do that, because I think it provides a level of extra added insulation that if the governor appoints and the Senate confirms, and the Senate confirms gubernatorial appointments, unless you tell me otherwise, I'm guessing the members of your Sunshine Committee never went in front of the Senate. Isn't that right?
That is true, yeah.
So I think that's an extra, so the governor gets to choose. If we were going to go down the road that Michael has described, then I think we ought to look at backing up the road and saying the feed-ins to the governor's office can be more controlled, I guess. But I wouldn't want to see, although I love your boss and I think she's wonderful, I think that Senate confirmation from gubernatorial appointments provides an added level of just kind of independence, to be honest. But that's just my take.
What about an MLAC model?
Oh my word, now we're like really out there. But MLAC doesn't have
MLAC works.
But I know MLAC works great, just look at the results. But MLAC,
For those of us who don't
oh, the Management Labor Advisory Council, this was created in 1991 legislature after about 15 years of workers' compensation wars to try to get the labor side and the management side to stop killing each other and destroying the system. And it has worked phenomenally. But keep in mind, Scott, MLAC doesn't have any real power. All they can do is vet proposals and say what they like and approve of and don't. Now, it's true that since 1991, to my knowledge, the legislature has never passed a workers' compensation bill not approved by MLAC, which is great. But I think that's a little different beast than this one, because they're more of a vetting tool to let the legislature know what they think.
Actually, I think the vetting tool for these bills makes perfect sense, because if you have a scenario where under the management labor, and for those of you who aren't fortunate enough to deal with the workers' comp world, the process is if you have a workers' comp bill, so let's say the league has a comp bill, we go to MLAC, we propose it, management and labor take shots at it and come back, and then we'll come up with a consensus and send that to the legislature. But it's incumbent upon the person who brought the bill. It's your bill, you're going to go pass it. If the goal of this commission was to get consensus on public records policy changes and recommendations, I think that might be the best way, because under any of the proposals we're looking at now, the PRA will be lobbying against if there's not consensus, we'll still be lobbying against a portion of the body of this group, which is not necessarily a great position to be in.
Yeah. I get your issue. And I hadn't even thought about MLAC, and MLAC is a great model. It's undeniable. It's a 30-year model. But I don't know. I need to stew on that.
The threat, and the thing about the advisory power of MLAC is the threat that the legislature would, if the MLAC doesn't do it, we saw this last time with some bills. I'm sorry if this is too insider-y baseball for
I'm a
each issue, but
yeah.
The threat that they would ignore it if the MLAC didn't act, I've seen that happen
repeatedly
multiple times, and so there's an incentive to negotiate and move it on.
Because people, in the workers' compensation, people are almost more afraid of losing the MLAC structure than any particular bill, because it's so valuable. So I don't disagree with anything that Scott said. I just have not had any time to stew on the notion of that model, which is a completely different model.
I don't fully understand. Would you mind clarifying?
So, in order to essentially depoliticize workers' comp battles in Oregon, used to have the highest rates with the worst benefits. How you do that is unclear. We did. Part of the reforms were that changes, as opposed to being simply put into the legislature by members, they would be submitted to a panel, and the panel is made up equally of labor interests and employer interests. And then those are subdivided out into different categories of labor and management. There's public, there's timber, there's ag, private public employee unions as well. And so you make your case in the hearings process for the bill, you present it, and then it's discussed, sometimes through work groups, and you negotiate out the bill, and it comes out, and it's still incumbent upon the person who is seeking the legislation to get it through the process. But I've never seen a scenario where an approved MLAC bill did not pass.
What would prevent us from adopting that process internally as a council? I mean,
well, I think the structural change there is that the public records advocate would serve as an executive director position, similar to OGEC and OLCC, though I don't like those models, and present and facilitate that discussion on top of the mediation and training duties, but would be a non-voting member.
So,
and that, but I also think that model those bills are still going through, are still with the agencies, they're still going through the legislative coordinator process, but you don't see that kind of influence. It wouldn't be possible to do that kind of influence with that model, with that management model. I think maybe if someone wants to go, and I'm sorry to suggest this, I really am, if you want to go and watch an MLAC hearing, I apologize, to see how that works, I personally think it's a model that we should be employing more often, not just in other areas.
but that would leave anyone who wants to have public records related legislation introduced would have to come through this council before they can introduce it at the legislature. Am I understanding correctly?
It's not really how MLAC works. So anybody can offer up workers' compensation legislation, and shortly after the Mahonia Hall Accords and all that stuff in the early 90s, people still did, preparing for continuing workers' compensation wars. But what we saw was those bills didn't get hearings. Those bills just didn't go anywhere. If it didn't go through MLAC, the legislature wasn't going to touch it.
This is last, a procedural question. Maybe one of our legislators could tell us. What is the calendar we're looking at to get a draft bill done in time to be considered by the short session?
So there's a November deadline.
A November what deadline?
So there's a November deadline for pre-session filing. So essentially, legislative concepts have to be delivered to Legislative Council by November, is it 22nd? I want to...
The guy who's going to write it.
Oh,
there. Right. Is it November 22nd?
That asks for pre-session filing bills, which we should.
But the bigger issue for us is that once I depart this position, which is happening in 2 weeks, the council has to turn to hiring my replacement.
Right. Yes.
So we kind of need to get this done today if we're going to get it done this year.
Well, and that's my next question, if I may. This is Les again. We had sort of a laundry list of concepts. So could we maybe go point by point through those concepts and see where the council is, and then, then turn to the actual language drafting with those, based off of those concepts?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. And Steve, I think you were the one who had the list of concepts.
Yeah, so the first one is a question of independence. And I guess...
The question of language that specifically says independence.
Right. Ginger's draft said explicitly the public records advocate shall function separately and independently from any other state agency. Rob's doesn't mention it, but he said he would be amenable to some language. Les's says the independent office of the public records advocate is created. And it sounds like Les's wording may have provide a little more comfort to other council members. I would prefer, personally, I like the explicitness of Ginger's proposal, but I would be okay with doing it Les's way and saying the independent office.
Sorry, go ahead.
This is Michael. I was just going to say, I think the reason that I like Ginger's is because she took it from an existing Oregon entity, the long-term care ombudsman, which is, you know, does, I think, do some policy type advocacy too, and it seems like a sensible model to me.
All right. Do others have thoughts? Anyone else on the phone have any thoughts on that?
No, I'm fine with Ginger's language. I was simply trying to be efficient with the words, but it's the concept that's more important than the language there. So I would be fine with that. So how do we want to proceed? Do we want to vote the council vote principle by principle?
I think that's probably the best way to go. This is drafting legislation by committee is tricky.
It's tricky.
But I think that that's probably the best way to go, to just go kind of concept by concept and then talk about the language.
But in this case, I think it makes sense to read verbatim what you have.
Yeah. Okay, so are we taking a vote then on the separate and independent language? Is that what's happening now?
Well, I would still move.
Is this like a vote, or are we like polling to see where we are? I'm just not sure what the vote means if I say I vote for that. I mean, I kind of feel like what I really want to vote on is just the overall product, and until we get there, like, I'm not sure we need formal votes. Just a thought.
But I need to know what to include in the overall product, because there are a bunch of moving pieces here. It would be helpful for me if I knew what to include in that overall product. My suspicion is that, you know, what we end up agreeing to on this council is going to be an amalgamation of all three of these proposals. So I just kind of need to know what pieces of what proposal are the ones what pieces of what proposal have the most support.
Right. I mean, maybe if we could just, maybe we don't need to vote, but if we can hear strong objections, it'd be useful. I thought I heard objections from you on it.
I'll be voting no on this, even though I'll be voting yes probably on the end result. I still don't want to do this statement because I don't like political statements in legislation, because I think it creates issues for opponents to hang their hat on and point to this and say, you've created a policy agency that is divorced from any statewide elected official, and they don't like this. And so I don't mind the statement. I just don't support it in being in this piece of legislation.
I think I do feel strongly in favor of this statement, in part because you all were probably not as carefully following the statements of the governor's office after my resignation. But the first statement that they made was a statement by Chris Pear, which was, well, we'll skip the beginning part of it and just go to the second part, where he said that it's unclear whether or not this was actually meant to be an independent office, which is why I think it might be helpful to just include language in there that says very clearly this is an independent office. So, I mean, that's part of the background of why I feel strongly about it, but I certainly understand Rob's feelings about this as well.
This is Mark Landauer. Could I ask Rob a question? Rob, is your concern about the independent or separate independence based on any of your separation of power concerns?
Yes, that's what I'm concerned about, but I'm also concerned about potential, and it would just be potential, political pushback, not liking this either from a political angle. I could be totally wet on both of those issues, and maybe nobody cares about either of those issues, but I'm worried, because normally when I craft legislation, I try to avoid putting any extraneous material in it. And I view this as extraneous, but I get the political point. I do. I get exactly what Ginger said, you know, in response. This is a direct response to a statement made. So I get that. I will just always cringe when political statements are in legislation, because I just don't like it.
Would you agree, though, with the statement that when this bill was being considered, that we were all sort of under the assumption, Rob, that the advocate would be somewhat operating separately and independently?
Oh, I agree with that. Absolutely. I agree with the statement itself.
Right.
This is last-
Is there, if I may, Rob, is there a way to thread the needle here?
Well, and I think that's what Les was trying to do, and I think he was actually going to make a motion. I heard him start his compromise language, which just doesn't do the additional sentence but adds the word independent, was an attempt at that.
I'm amenable to that.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that that's a good compromise. It makes it clear so that there's no ambiguity on the part of any political figures in the future.
I'll move that we add the word independent to 192-461 sub 1 in front of the word office.
Great, thank you.
Second.
Do we have a second? Okay.
It's Les seconded.
All right. That was Les, right?
Yeah.
Okay. All in favor?
Well, Ginger, before the vote takes place, could we have the sentence repeated for everybody?
Yep, I can do that. Let me make sure I'm looking at the right piece of paper. Okay. This is 192-461 sub 1. The independent office of the public records advocate is created.
Thank you.
Changing the official name of the office, or is that part of the legal name of the office, or not? It's not.
All I independent.
Office is small, also, but you still consider that part of the official name.
Yeah, no, it should be, it's independent office of the public records advocate is created. That's the language.
Scott, does that give you greater comfort, or still less? Okay.
So all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye. Hello, everyone. Tony's here, by the way.
Oh, hi, Tony. Tony, did you hear what we're discussing? I'm not sure when you
Yes,
arrived.
I've been on for a little bit. Thanks.
Okay, let me just do a roll call so I make sure I have the votes right. All right, in the room, Steve.
Aye.
Okay, Rob.
No.
Okay, Scott.
No.
Deputy
To
Secretary.
address your concern.
Yes.
And I'll do a vote.
Sorry, I'm taking notes. It takes me a minute. I will vote aye. All right, folks on the phone, let me just go down the list. Les.
Aye.
Okay. Mark.
Oh, you're killing me. Aye.
Michael.
Sorry, I'm here. I had my mute button on. I'm still not entirely sure, like, what the effect of this vote is. Like, if we approve this and then can't agree on other stuff, what we have. So I'm just going to abstain from these votes, but I support this as a concept, and I'm happy to support legislation that includes this phrase.
And can I switch my vote to abstain? Because what Michael said is more reflective of where I'm at. I support the concept, don't want this in the legislation, but ultimately I'm going to wind up supporting the legislation.
I feel a lot better.
And I would go along with Rob too. I just feel I'm a little over my skis, but I go back to when we were originally working on this bill in 2017. I think we can all largely agree that our theory was that this was going to operate largely independently, so I'm fine with that approach. But if, Ginger, you do not have a majority vote to proceed as a result of that, I'm willing to switch back to aye.
Okay. I'm just trying to figure out how we should proceed here. I mean, it is possible we could just go ahead and vote on Les's compromise legislation.
Why don't you just kind of poll us in a way that's like a vote, but without a motion, so you know what you're going to have support for, and then when you have, like, the end, then you can have us vote on, like, a whole product. That, I mean, and you can run it sort of like a vote, but I'm not, like, I don't think that this by itself does what we want, and if we vote to approve this and can't agree on anything else, then I don't know, it just seems weird to me. So
Okay.
I'm being a little bit of a pedantic parliamentarian. I just realized that as I was talking, and I apologize to everyone.
That's okay. Let's just go ahead and do this by poll then. Todd, you had a comment?
Well, yeah, just on observing the process and also the cheat sheet's trying to think through what would work best. Steve proposed 4 concepts that are meant to encapsulate what the issues being addressed in any new statute would be, and perhaps a binding vote by the council to agree to those concepts or some version thereof. and then defining language for each after that would be the best way to move forward. So you leave here with the draft, and everybody is at least aware of, like, you know, what the overarching parameters are and what the suggested language for each is. Perhaps with the advocate being delegated the duty of drafting the final version.
Well, I don't think we'll be able to get it in time for the legislative session, I think, is the problem. Let's move forward with just the kind of straw poll, how people are feeling about each of these issues, and then I will just do a mock-up of the legislation, which will probably look fairly similar to at least one of these proposals, and we can vote on that. Because we need to have, if we're going to do something in time for the short legislative session, we should have a legislative concept now. That's not to say that that legislative concept won't or can't be amended later, but if we want to get something introduced, we should try to do that today. We have several more hours, so we should move along with that. All right, so on the independence question, just a quick poll. So far I have, for adding the language that Les has in his proposal, the independent office of the Public Records Advocate is created. I have Steve, the Deputy Secretary, myself, Les, Mark, and Michael in favor of that language. Is that correct?
No, I think you have Michael abstaining and Mark abstaining.
Well, Michael was abstaining to taking a formal vote on that. I'm trying to get people's opinion about whether or not we should add that, and then at the end we can talk about the legislation and put something together.
I think Ginger's calling this a straw poll now, just to.
Yeah.
Got it.
Straw poll.
Got it.
Getting people's feelings.
Ginger, this is Tony. I support it too.
Okay.
So jumping in there, this is Kim. Are we withdrawing that motion and then just putting it forward as a straw?
Let's withdraw that motion for now. I think that's a good idea. All right.
So it sounds like we're moving forward with adding the word independent.
Yes, but we'll vote.
As part of the package.
Yeah, you
part
get
of
to
the
see the full text. So
all right, next concept.
The next concept was, should the advisory council appoint the public records advocate?
Or be selected. Should the advocate be selected by the council as opposed to by the governor's office?
I would make a motion that the advocate should be appointed by the council.
Okay.
Can we, I mean, should we just do this without motion?
Oh, yeah, no motion, yeah. I think we ought to do that.
Okay.
I have a question, subject to Senate confirmation?
No, because it wouldn't be a gubernatorial appointment.
Okay, under this, would they be a voting member of the council?
Depends on what draft you go.
Yeah, that's a separate question.
Okay, we'll jump off that bridge when we get to it.
Yes.
Okay.
So
The question on the table for this straw poll, which is not an official vote in any way, you can still change your mind. The question on the table is, should the advocate be appointed by the council? Is that a fair characterization of the question?
Yep.
And I say yes.
Okay, so let me go around the room real quick. All right, Steve.
Yes.
Okay. Rob, yes. Scott.
Yes.
Okay, Deputy Secretary.
Yes.
All right, and I will also vote yes on that. All right, on the phone I have Les.
Yes.
Okay. Mark.
Yes.
Okay, Michael.
Yes.
And Tony.
Yes.
Okay, great. We have consensus on that. Okay, next concept.
Should the council be able to, shall the public records advocate be removable for cause by the council? And this is somewhat interlinked with the notion of
Link it.
Okay.
Just do it.
Okay. So the public records advocate will serve a 4-year term unless removed for cause by the council.
And that should be, I think, by a majority, not a super majority or anything.
Just simple majority.
Majority. So,
Okay.
So removal by the council for cause and review every 4 years.
Yes. I don't know whether we need to say to be reviewed every 4 years, but I think if we say 4-year term, that sort of
yeah.
Appoints for a 4-year term.
Yeah.
Majority vote. Okay, all right. Steve.
Yes.
Okay, Rob.
Yes, I prefer my alternative, but I like that one too.
All right, Scott.
Yes.
Okay, Deputy Secretary.
Yes.
Myself, yes. All right. Folks on the phone, I'm just going to keep it in the same order. Les?
Yes.
Okay. Mark?
Yes.
Okay. Michael?
Yes.
And Tony? Tony? Oh, sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Heard that.
Heard that.
Sorry about that. Yes.
All right, Tony, you're looking for your answer. Yes?
Yes. Sorry, I had phone issues.
Okay. All right, so that is everyone for that one. Okay, next concept.
Should the public records advocate be the chair, well, phrase it alternatively, should the chair of the Public Records Council be someone other than the public records advocate?
I think, so why don't, for this one, why don't we look at the language that Rob used? Because I think he had a good piece of language for that. The council shall elect a chairperson and vice chairperson for such terms and duties as the council may require, which is the possibility. Maybe the council wants the advocate to be the chairperson, who knows? But I like that language. I think it's clear and it allows some flexibility for the council.
I lifted it right out of the ethics committee.
Ginger?
Yes.
This is Les. I greatly apologize, everyone. I have to jump off here for a few minutes, but I support that concept, and I'll be back as soon as I can.
Okay, so let's vote yes in favor of that. Okay. I'm just going to note this down as Rob chair proposal. Okay. All right. So straw poll, totally non-binding.
Ginger, Mark Landauer again. Sorry for this. Could you please repeat what it is that we're polling on now?
Okay. Right now, we are polling on one of Rob's provisions that was part of his proposal. The council shall elect a chairperson and vice chairperson for such terms and duties as the council may require, which means that the council could decide the advocate is the chair of the council, or the council could decide to appoint someone else as the chair. It's up to the council.
Thank you.
And while I do think, I will say, I think it's important that the advocate be a leader, and I think for all intents and purposes, oftentimes the advocate who is doing probably most of the organizing for this council will be the chairperson. I could see a situation where if you're dealing with someone who is perhaps behaving irresponsibly and you want to be able to remove them, it might be awkward if they're the chair of your council.
Or someone whose skill set is just not conducive to being a chair. Not you, because you do that. I mean, you take charge, but some people don't like that.
Some people aren't so inclined. So while I was originally not so amenable to this, I think that Rob has made pretty good arguments in favor of it.
Quick question while we're on this.
I would be in favor.
Rob, in terms and duties as the council may require, so do we have, I mean, how, in what form would we create terms and duties? Do we have like bylaws? We don't have bylaws.
No, I don't have bylaws, but generally each of these commissions basically makes a motion through Robert's Rules of Orders to appoint someone for a year or two, or whatever it happens to be. My guess is we'd rotate the chair, but who knows? We might do something different.
And you often adopt rules for whatever term that appointment is or that election is.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was originally not in favor of this idea, but I think Rob has made good arguments, which are pretty valid. So.
You do. I say yes.
All right. So Steve, yes. Rob, I'm assuming.
I should say no right now. No, yes. Yes.
Scott.
Yes.
Okay. Deputy Secretary.
Yes.
Okay, and myself, yes. All right. Les just jumped off the phone, but he said yes before he left. Mark.
Yes.
Michael.
Yes.
And Tony?
Yes.
Okay, all right. Awesome, we're having consensus on a lot of things. I'm very happy about this. What's next on our laundry list?
Well, let's see, this didn't come up, maybe it came up explicitly. Should the public records advocate no longer be a voting member of the council?
I think we already address that by adopting my proposal, because that means the advocate is on the council, but not necessarily the chair.
Yeah, that was what was left.
But you raise a legitimate point, because the Ethics Commission and the OLCC, those examples, those directors are not on those commissions. Right. So I don't know.
Well,
what that would mean was removing that entire subsection above there. You'll see it. You see a little M above there. I wouldn't just strike the language. I would strike the whole M.
I don't know. I feel strongly that the advocate should be a voting member of the council. I mean, perhaps not the chair, but, and let's be honest, like, most of the duties of running the council are probably going to fall to the advocate.
Right.
So, I mean, the advocate is going to be there in the room, but if the advocate doesn't actually get to advocate for any kind of policy or vote on policy on the council, I mean, the advocate has a knowledge that's unique from anyone else who's serving on the council or even state government. I mean, I've spent, the last year and a half going around and speaking to folks around the state about their experiences from across the spectrum of government and requester community. And I think that that does give me a unique perspective, and to not be able to vote, I think, would be problematic. It, loses the council. But is there a way that we could have a provision that says that the advocate would be kept out of the vote if it was a vote of or cause removal?
And
Well,
deliberation.
you would have to, because that would be an ethics violation.
Yeah.
For the member in about 4 different categories, so.
And I don't think we need to address that.
Yeah.
Because ethics law will compel the advocate to not participate. Independently.
Well, it does change your majority level for termination, though, because.
It does.
Well, we have 13, including her.
13, but if,
But conflict doesn't change quorum, right?
so no, I think it would be the same. I think you'd still need 7 votes.
Hey, this is Kim. What is it? What are the requirements for the long-term care ombudsman in this regard?
There's no real equivalent to that I'm aware of, because to my knowledge, there isn't a commission that oversees and hires the ombudsman, because they're more attached to the department. So this is really, this is a unique model. I'm not aware of any model in which the advocate selected by a commission actually sits on that commission. But that's the model we've been operating under since the 2017 legislation. And I've heard Ginger's arguments, and I think the advocate ought to be on the council. I know it's weird, but that's just my take. But it's not a legal thing. It's just I'll stop talking.
I think it has to do with the public's confidence in the role that we play. I'm almost of the opinion that Ginger, and maybe I'm a bit off here, but I think that Ginger sort of represents the public here, the public interest. We are all largely attached to this committee for reasons having to do with our professional lives. Although I know we do have a member of the public, I do think that Ginger serves in part that role, and I'm comfortable with her being a voting member on the committee.
Should we pull it?
Probably. How should we pose the question? Should the advocate be on the council?
Yeah, as a voting member, as contemplated in.
As existing
Today.
Yeah, exactly.
With
Or in
no
the
changes,
proposal that
right.
Rob submitted.
Right.
Just a second.
So a yes to that question would mean keep it as is,
Keep it as is.
on the council.
Yeah. All right, Steve.
Yes.
Okay, Rob?
Yes.
Okay, Scott?
No.
Okay, Deputy Secretary?
Yes.
Okay, and myself, yes. Les, I don't think is back on the phone, but Les, if you're on the phone, let us know. Okay, so Les is not here. Okay, Mark?
Yes.
Michael?
Yes.
Okay. Tony?
Yes.
Okay, and I think that is all of the voting members?
Oh.
Okay. All right, next issue.
Legislation, I think I can lump It's basically paragraph 11 of Rob's proposal.
Okay, great.
Council may support or oppose legislation relating to public records law. Council may request that one or more legislators introduce legislation relating to public records law.
Okay. I like this, as I said, for all of the reasons that I said. And this is the last paragraph. Perfect. Okay. All right. So do we want to go ahead and pull it? Do we want to have more conversations? Let's go ahead and take a little drop roll. Steve?
Yes.
Okay. Rob?
Yes.
Okay. Scott?
I'm going to be a no on that.
Deputy Secretary?
Yes.
Okay, and myself, yes. Les, I don't think it's here yet. Mark?
Yes.
Michael?
Yeah.
And Tony?
Yes.
All right, this is good. I feel like we're coalescing around a lot of things. Okay.
Ginger, if we could have bifurcated that, I think I would be okay on 11A.
Okay.
B is just, isn't it kind of an outflow of A? I mean,
It is an outflow of A in part, but I get what Scott's saying. If you just had A, then that would drive it through the governor's office process.
Yeah, but the council members would still be able to testify in favor of it as we did this time around.
Yeah, but I don't think you need a provision like that in statute, because anybody can testify for any reason. I'm okay with it. I'm okay with A. It's the B where I'm having the heartburn.
Okay. Understood. Is there anything left on the list?
are we understanding that this is the only avenue for us to, as a council, to advocate for legislation now, because there's no longer...
Well, I mean, there's a number of ways we can advocate for legislation that doesn't require this subsection 11. We can submit legislation through the normal executive department process and send it to the governor's office. It becomes a governor's priority. You know, she introduces it. If not, it doesn't get introduced. We have independent legislators on the phone right now that are on the council, non-voting members, who could take the legislation that we're talking about today and introduce it without our permission. I mean, they can introduce whatever they want, within the limits. And so,
We could take it to the Senate president. We could take
it to where you could take it. But the issue here is, and let's not forget it, the issue that was raised through the media coverage, to be honest, and people's responses was that there was an assertion that the council, as part of the executive branch, should only submit it through the governor's office process. Mm-hmm. And so absent some legislation, we've kind of been put on notice that what we did last session wasn't proper. Now, whether we can debate that, yes or no, but I guess the reason I crafted sub 11 was to directly address that, and that issue kind of cropped up in the middle of this process. So that's my explanation for it. I get what Scott's concern is on B, but
I would say, I would strike D and add the word propose to the list. So support, propose, oppose, or propose legislation relating to public records law.
That kind of leaves us where we were before. Because, I mean, we proposed legislation, but then we didn't have a vehicle to necessarily get that legislation introduced. And that also, I will say in hindsight, I feel uncomfortable about the way that went, and it could have put me in an awkward position, advocating for the council's legislation, going and finding sponsors for it, and feeling like maybe I was acting outside of my own authority or the council's authority under the statute. It was just a strange position for us to be in, and I think it was partly by virtue of the timing. But I also feel strongly that the council's legislation shouldn't go through the governor's setting process, because that process is often very untransparent, and this is a transparency council. I think that if a public body wants to oppose this council's legislation, they should have to do it out in the open and in the sunlight, instead of behind closed doors or in some sort of process that's not going to be released to the public. And I would feel differently about that if the governor's office hadn't literally fought the litigation over keeping those legislative concepts secret.
So we're down to a draft that is exactly what Rob proposed, with simply adding the word independent before office.
Well, not quite.
No, and revised language in that sub 3.
Yeah, sub
So
2.
I think the thing that we're closest to is
You could-
Les's draft.
What did we change in sub 2?
Well, it's not serving at the discretion, but can be removed for cause.
I also want to just let you all know that there is a piece in this legislation that even as it stands was a flaw and an inconsistency in the legislation. And that current paragraph 6, the public records advocate is in the unclassified service. When I talked to BHR folks about that, that unclassified service is a designation for people who serve at the pleasure of the governor. So we need to remove that language or the statute is going to be kind of.
And I think there are a number of other technical changes that I have in here that aren't substantive, and that's one of them. You'll see that in all the drafts. Plus, yeah, there's a number of tweaks that I don't think are substantive, and somebody's going to have to just plug them in. But I think you're right, Deputy Secretary. I think we're basically at my draft 2 with 2 changes.
Yeah.
The insertion of the independent, and then the complete rewrite of sub 2. Probably is closest in Les's draft, but I'd have to look at it.
So if we want to take a break, what I can do is I can put that together real quick.
Or I can do it from right here. I got the Word document.
Okay, great. Yeah, and let me give you, you have Les's Word document. So from Les's, we pulled paragraphs 2 and 4, which is the term and the advocate appointed by the council and the 7 members vote.
I'm on it.
So 1, 2, and 4 of Les's. And if you all want to take a break, we've been here for a little while. Yes. Yeah, that's all good. Yeah, we'll leave it running.
Oh, that's going to be in October 1.
It sure is.
Oh, my God. You still do your conference in November, don't you, Rob?
Yeah.
Oh, you're done. Yeah.
Lucky man. Oh, no, I got to change that around. Okay.
Stored.
And also, the only other thing is that unclassified language.
Got rid of it.
Perfect, thank you. You guys have Wi-Fi, don't you? Because I don't have Wi-Fi here. Is there guest Wi-Fi?
Almost done.
me like 3 more.
Yeah. So scoring sheets, we make sure. Yeah, that's right.
So do you read the current statute that requires to, 130 days of when you leave?
No, just to turn to the issue.
Yeah.
That's how I read it too.
Yeah.
And it looks like for whatever reason, the statute says we can't consider anything else on the agenda other than that one issue.
Yeah.
You have to have a meeting with the
Just for that.
whole purpose meeting.
And it has to be within 30 days of your last day. We should schedule it before we leave.
Yeah, my last day, it looks like now is gonna be the 14th, because I have some additional things I need to wrap up.
Okay.
But we can consider other business before a new advocate is selected.
Oh, yeah. It's just that we have to have a standalone meeting for the purpose of kicking that off, which is
And I'm
just,
hoping to see that up at the end of this meeting. Stephanie helpfully pulled up the minutes from the meeting before my hiring, that should help to let us know what the council did then.
yeah, just have to do some audio.
Take this with us.
See. And if I send this to you, can you shoot this out to the council?
I think send it to, because I'm having problems with the Wi-Fi.
Okay.
I think send it to either Stephanie or,
Let Stephanie's logged
I'm on, if you want to just send it to.
or just, yeah, you
Or
can
just send it out. I guess I
send
could
it to
just,
Rack, and then everyone has it.
Yeah,
I'll just send it out. Okay, and then, because I want people to read this to make sure I don't miss it. Which I probably did. Like,
Yeah,
more
no.
retroactive.
My computer doesn't always play well with my Wi-Fi.
Actually, that's the word before with a comma after it. 2 words which confounded me.
You walk around with the computer.
Actually, it's the Secretary of State computer,
Oh, then.
but I have a DAC phone.
You should just get out, so do I, and that's conversation. You should get Albert to look at that, because it
Okay,
should be easily accessible.
yeah.
For the 14 pages left.
Okay, just look real quick. I think I got everything.
Stephanie, you would be proud of me. I organized all the files on my computer, and there is not a missed file or a Ginger Stuff file.
Oh, Ginger Stuff?
No.
Yeah, good.
That's in the right direction.
Clearly, I've been paying attention.
We've only seen the spiel.
Like 100 times, literal 100 times.
If you haven't got it by now.
I was tempted to make one just to be ironic.
You'd have like a Word document.
Yeah. Ginger Stuff, and inside would just be a bunch of cat pictures. Wouldn't be the first.
You'd be the first. For sure.
Or I could copy the Taylor Swift Revenge Nerds file. What even is that?
It was, I don't know.
I Googled it at one point.
I don't know.
It's just a picture of Taylor Swift,
Yeah, it was something that one of our former team members.
which really
mocked
doesn't
up
belong
for
on
us.
anyone's work computer.
Oh, we gotta do a redirect, that's your, you say you have to get on Wi-Fi.
Oh, yeah, you know how to fix that?
No, I know how to force a redirect.
Sorry. I was too long. Oh. Oh. That was really.
I have some fungible skills.
Okay, now I'm just. So if I go into, So if I send it to, because I never sent it to the entire prac, because I wouldn't, PRC_PRA, it's that one I grab onto.
Yeah, yeah, Public Records Advisory Council at Oregon.gov, one word, yeah.
Oh, really? That, I've been using PRC.
So here's what I'm gonna do, because I'm paranoid about public meetings law, I'm sending it VCC to the prac. And I'm sending it to myself, that way nobody can hit reply to all and do something unlawful. Yay. Hey. To all. Okay, I just hit send, so hopefully your inbox has just got something. Maybe. Did anybody get it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
Yep.
Can you put it on the screen, maybe?
I got it.
I had to restore some language in subsection 4 of section 1 in order to make what Steve's proposals fit. So you'll see that. And I had to do a couple other minor tweaks to make your decisions kind of flow. But you'll see it.
And for the record, this is Les. I'm back on.
Oh, great. Thank you, Les.
Yeah, that looks good.
Did I miss anything?
I don't think so. I think you got it. You sure you don't want to go to the legislative council?
I used to work there.
Just
I did. I don't even want to tell you what years. It was, well, let's just say it was 3 decades ago.
Let's just say most things were bipedal with short arms.
Did you work there with Paul Snyder?
No. No, he was
Actually, earlier than that.
Gil Riddell was earlier than that, too.
I think we got,
Do I have a mistake?
it was just a
Do I type up?
typo, didn't you want to delete this?
No, because the public records
Oh, I
advocate
see.
stays on the council.
Okay.
Just is not automatically chair.
So you want to strike the letter M?
No, leave M in place.
Oh, I see, there's all separate.
That's the 13th position of
Got
the
it,
council.
okay.
Yeah. Now, if the vote had gone the other way, then I would have removed the whole subsection.
Right.
Paragraph.
What is subsection 3, except as provided in sub?
So 3, basically, the new sub 3 replaces the piece of M right above it that got removed, so that the advocate is no longer automatically the chair. The purpose of sub 3 is to basically say, council, select your own chair and vice chair.
Oh, I see.
Which I think is how the vote went down.
I think, I mean, I would be okay with this, but isn't when it's saying except as provided subsection 3, old 3 is this.
Yeah.
And it's talking about a filling of the vacancy.
No, this is, so old sub 3, paragraph A, basically said the Secretary of State designee is the chair when the advocate is not the chair, but since we're making the advocate no longer the chair, the chair is whoever the council.
No longer relevant.
Yeah, so I removed A because it's not relevant anymore.
Rob, I don't know what's going on there, but are you also tweaking your summary?
I didn't do much. No, I didn't change the summary around. I could. The summary, just to let you know, Les, The summary is entirely within the exclusive power of legislative council. There's only one thing that legislators can't tell legislative council what to do, and that's their summary. They retain independent authority over it. So please know the legislative council will add their own summary, and it will be just that. It will be theirs, untouchable.
Yeah, we'll have to strike, because there's language in there that says the advocate serves at the pleasure of the.
Right. So yeah, ignore the summary.
Okay.
In fact, I'll rewrite it. I'll rewrite it. I'll make it I could even remove it.
And Rob, just for the record, This is Mark Landauer. I think that let's be sure that we maintain as narrow of a relating clause as possible as well.
Yeah, and actually, I agree with that, Mark, and the one I chose may be actually too narrow. I need to think about that now that we've...
It's relating to the council too now, too.
It is, but I agree with you, Mark, that we probably ought not to introduce a piece of legislation that just says relating to public records.
I would full-heartedly support that direction.
Public Records Advisory Council to appoint.
I've already been asked if we're going to have a bill that somebody can attach an amendment to, so.
So I'll stew on the title and I'll tweak with the summary, but that's not substantive.
So we want to just go ahead and talk about the part that's below a bill for an act.
Yep.
So let's just say we're talking and voting on that. So do we want to go ahead and move to vote on this?
And we're voting on it without the summary, is that right?
Yeah, we're voting on everything that's below a bill for an act.
Yeah.
Okay. Actually, everything that's below be enacted by the enacting clause.
Oh, okay.
Forget about the title.
Okay, everything below be enacted. I will so move.
Yeah.
Second.
All right, second, okay. All right, all in favor? I'm going to go around the room and then I'll go around on the phone. Steve?
Aye.
Rob?
Aye.
Sorry, I'm just taking the vote here. Scott?
No.
Deputy Secretary?
Yes.
All right, and myself, aye. And folks on the phone, I have Les?
Yes.
Okay. Mark?
Yes.
Michael?
Yes.
And Tony?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, we have a majority on that, so we have language. Thank you all. Hooray. Okay.
I'll send you a cleaned up one with a summary that actually makes sense, but please know that everything above the relating to, or everything above that is going to be just ignored by LC anyway, so.
Perfect. All right, thank you all very much for all of your work on this. Very happy we have a piece of legislation. We have someone who's going to introduce it. I don't know about you all, but I plan to submit testimony in favor of that, and I hope that you will also testify in favor of it. So the next matter of business we have, and oh my goodness, amazingly, we are actually on schedule, is to discuss next steps for hiring of the next advocate. Now, Stephanie, I think, has helpfully pulled up the minutes from the meeting where you all discussed hiring prior to my joining you, and the folks that maybe that will help us to have this conversation. I wasn't here for that, obviously, so others probably have better ideas about how this should go than I would. So I will leave it to you. Chris is going to pull up. Perfect. October 3rd, 2017. And I just realized I haven't invited any folks on the phone. If anyone on the phone wants to comment at this time, please do feel free, or if you want to wait until later, we'll have more time for that as well. We don't have any online comments, do we?
So, is there more about?
Okay, so
This is our very first meeting?
apparently, yeah. Yes.
I don't know that we talked about process there. We talked about the process for hiring? Mm-hmm.
Well, so I guess the reason I thought we'd bring this up is, just so that people remember the qualities and what they were looking for in terms of understanding of ORS 192, trainings experience, public speaking experience, sort of thing. These are all on the website, by the way, on the Public Records Advisory Council website. So public can read through the early minutes and.
Okay, so it looks like the way that it was done last time is that it was the Secretary of State Human Resources Division, which was in charge of posting the job posting. I guess we should probably talk about, if we're happy with that, we want to go ahead and do the same.
Is that resource still available to us?
Yeah. Tasha Peterson is our HR director. She does a really good job. We could
have her look at the posting, see if it may not need to change anything.
I suspect we're not going to have to change it much.
The one important thing to note about that is that the first time that the posting was posted, it said that you had to be a member of the Oregon Bar. That was later changed to say that you had to be eligible to become. And that was what made the difference so that I could apply for this position. Because the first time I looked at it, I thought, well, that looks like a great position, but I'm not in the Oregon Bar yet.
Yeah.
So.
Where did you see it, Ginger? Do you remember?
A friend of mine sent it along to me, from Reporters Committee, actually one of my former interns.
Oh.
And the first time we posted it, there were only 8 that met the MQs. The group had agreed that a law degree was required, so that's another reason why I wanted to point out the minutes. Is that something, you know?
It's in the legislation.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So our HR department weeded out those that do not have a law degree, but that was agreed upon by the council.
Yeah, I mean, the statute says the records advocate shall be a member in good standing to Oregon State Bar, and the way we kind of got around that with you is you actually didn't start until you were a member.
Exactly, yeah, you have to be eligible at least. And that process didn't take that long. I think that I submitted my application for reciprocity, sometime maybe in late December. It was after I had had the first interview with the governor's folks, because I didn't want to pay $1,000 without having some sense that I was going to get a job.
Now, go ahead.
Going back to should we change that in the statute, just since if we're opening it up anyway?
I don't see a reason to, but.
To say eligible for membership and.
No.
I think by the time they're appointed, they should be.
They should be. Yeah, I don't think just eligible, because what if you don't make it? But I was going to say something else, which I just was reminded of. You know, we did pass legislation in 19 that this council promoted, and one of the things it did change, but not effective till January 1, is it basically tells us to give the governor 3 names. Now, that's what we did last time, but we weren't under a compulsion to give her 3 names. We could have given her 1, 5, 12, 20, whatever. But the requirement to give 3 doesn't kick in till January 1. So I'm not suggesting we do something other than 3. 3 makes sense to me.
We're not likely to be prepared to give her anything until January 1 anyway.
So that's probably true as well. Just the process, yeah. So maybe that's a moot point.
Hey, process question for you. I'm sorry, process question for you. This is Tim Thatcher. And Rich, does the secretary post just on the state website and such, or is there outreach to national organizations that might have, you know, good candidates that we could pick from?
For virtually all of the positions that we advertise for, we do have a variety of external posting sites. And that's a good question, Kim. We should probably brainstorm before we actually do the posting as to where some good external sites would be. We definitely don't want to just make it internal.
And this is Ginger, I would also be happy to reach out via my network, in DC, through Reporters Committee, through, one of my friends has a transparency jobs listserv, through Twitter, through all of the other organizations that I work in DC. I would be happy to reach out and distribute this listing there too.
And I'm hoping that, given the coverage that the media has given this issue in the last month or so, I'm hoping that the media helps us at that point too by spreading the word through a general statement of some kind.
Yeah, and some of the other connections, so Todd and I have good connections with the U.S. Ombudsman's Association, with COGL, which is I forget what that's called.
Council on Government Ethics Law.
I have good connections with the National Freedom of Information Coalition and Reporters Committee and Muckrock. I think those would all be good places to do this.
So that brings up one question in my mind, and that is, for recruitment purposes, how do you think that candidate will, in particular, Ginger, will respond, knowing undoubtedly, if they Google it or about what happened, about the current situation? Is that cloud going to significantly dampen recruitment? I mean, we can tell people we got a fix on the way, but it's no guarantee. But how do you think that factors into the recruitment?
Let me address that if I could, Steve. I think the timing on this thing is going to be interesting. I'm confident that we wouldn't be ready to send names to the governor before around the 1st of January anyway. But we may, as a council, look at this and say, let's wait and see what the legislature does with our proposed legislative changes before we complete this process. If there's nothing else on our plate that is really causing us any kind of heartburn, we've got a deputy still in place, for example, to continue to carry out the day-to-day duties of the office. I think we're going to want to consider that timing.
We do a lot of recruitments in what we have in the past. And a lot of those are in situations where there's been tumult locally and people know it. And I think it actually gets you, I think there are people who just gravitate to those sorts of positions for the challenge, for whatever reason. So I think based on our experience when we hired done the searches for our, within the association, I don't think it's going to hamper too much. I think we actually probably get people we want who are familiar with the history.
But part of the political calculus is, do we want to have the governor make the appointment, or do we want to wait and make the appointment?
Right, that's another factor, right? But that brought to mind, I wonder, to keep our options open, does this bill that we have here now, this bill concept, does it have an emergency clause, or should it?
Good question.
So, I mean, I'll refer to Scott.
Can we perhaps ask Senator Thatcher her feelings about that?
Yeah, that's a good point.
I didn't quite hear the questions. Could you repeat it, please?
So the question is, do we want to include an emergency clause in this legislation? That, I think, is that a correct statement?
Yeah, so that we would have the option, if the spot is not filled at the end of the session, then we would immediately be the ones to make the appointment.
I think there's a reason to include an emergency clause. It's easily explainable to people why it would be necessary. I think it would be, I would advocate for that.
That's saying something, because Senator Thatcher is not necessarily a fan of emergency clauses.
Without good reason.
That's why I asked the question.
That's a really good question. That is not something I thought of.
I'll say what Rich was implying, which is e-clauses are now political, and they're not favored by members of, in many cases, both parties. I think Senator Thatcher's right in the sense that if she or legislators feel like they can articulate that on the floor, that's different. But I have not seen a bill go through the legislature that didn't necessarily need an e-clause, that had one added that didn't get questioned pretty seriously on the Senate floor and the House floor now. So, I mean, there is some risk to putting an e-clause on. I mean, because people will say, why is this an emergency?
Well, the political question is inherent in the change in the legislation anyway.
Yep.
The governor no longer appoints, the council appoints. And given that we're at that inflection point, I can't imagine that anybody would have a hard time understanding why the E-clause would be added. But I agree with, Kim. I'm thinking that we ought to probably ask legislative council to include it.
Do we need to vote on that? No.
Probably we should do a vote on that. Okay, someone want to move for that?
I'll move that.
Okay.
Second.
Second.
All right, I will go around the room, and, sorry, I'm running out of space here.
Hold on a minute. Karan, are you still on?
Yep, I'm still here.
Do you have any different thoughts on this E-clause question?
I don't. I think if Senator Thatcher feels like it's comfortable, then we have a good, it stands a good chance of being accepted by both parties. And it's also been top of mind for a lot of people, so I think they will understand.
Thanks.
Okay, so we have a motion, we have a second. The matter before us is including an emergency clause on this legislation, and I will go around the room. Okay, Steve?
Aye.
Okay, Rob?
Aye, based on what the legislators said.
Scott?
I'm going to abstain on this.
Okay. Deputy Secretary?
Yes.
And I will vote aye. All right, folks on the phone. Les?
Yes.
Mark?
Yes.
Oh, sure, why not?
And Tony?
Yes.
Okay. All right, great. Motion passes, so we will include the emergency clause. Go back to the conversation that we were having.
So I also wonder, Mr. Secretary, given, I think that makes sense, that inherently this is going to take a while. Do we want to deliberately bump it out so that we can say to candidates, we have all this resolved, here's the job, here's who you report to, here's who the decision makers are? I mean, would there be benefits to that? And I guess it's also somewhat contingent on how our deputy feels about his next move in this office.
Yeah, so the day that Ginger leaves, I think today we should decide that the day Ginger leaves, the council is recognizing the deputy as the acting public records advocate, so that we have that formally established. I don't think we ought to make that decision quite yet, Steve. I think that to the degree we possibly can, I think we ought to depoliticize this. And to make a decision today that says, no, we're not going to send this to the governor, so we don't trust the governor, would be politicizing it unnecessarily. We may surprise ourselves, and even though we're deliberate about the process, we may find by January 1 that we've got 3 really, really good candidates, and that any one of them chosen by the governor we would be happy with for a 4-year term. And then the legislation's not going to do anything except just confirm that. So I think we defer that question.
I think any potential candidates would likely be at least somewhat comforted by the governor's public statements on this, and the fact that it would be politically toxic at this point for the governor's office to try to intervene. So I think hopefully that will be a comfort to those candidates in the meantime while we get this legislation passed.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, ideally, the timing would have lined up, and I apologize for this, for all of you all, that I kind of held my other job off as long as I could. And also I'm dealing with the fact that I have to drive 2 cars across the country. So leaving any later than this would have been very tricky, but ideally the timing would have lined up for the legislation to get passed closer to the time that I would be leaving, but. So
I I think the only thing we need to do is set a date, that is at least within 30 days of the date that Ginger anticipates leaving, which is 14th of October, to have a meeting to formally establish the process for our recruitment. And if you want to pull calendars, I'm happy to.
Yeah, and I do
And you're going to
intend,
wind up chairing that meeting.
I'll chair that one, or whoever.
No, I think statute says
yeah.
Well, it's Bev or whoever she designates.
And I do intend to engage in that process as the statute allows.
You gonna do that by phone? Are you gonna be out of here?
Yeah, I'm leaving the 19th.
Okay.
So I will be on the phone. I think that, if I recall correctly from the last time when I took the job, the council met and sort of decided these kinds of things, and then they had another meeting where they discussed and agreed on interview questions, and then the meeting after that was the hiring meeting, but I could be recalling that incorrect.
They also reviewed candidates.
That's right. So the questions, and then the candidates,
Yep.
and then the interviews.
Yes.
And the interviews were a public meeting, so, which was awkward, but necessary, I suppose.
We had talked with Bev about November 6th, but I'm just throwing that out there.
Oh, you're right. I remember that conversation.
And I've reserved the room for November 6th. but
Although
that's
that's
for the council.
that's the day after I get back from Samoa, so, I remember that being a source of consternation as well.
Yeah, I will be out of the country from the 4th until the 10th, so I won't be able to participate in that meeting. Sorry, but I won't be calling you all from Greece.
What about the 12th or 13th of November?
That would be good.
Is that within 30 days?
Yeah, because my
Yeah.
last day now is gonna be the 14th.
14th,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. I'm good either of those days.
Okay.
When's your conference, Ron?
it's the following. Yeah, that's good for me. Yeah, it's the following.
So,
The 13th would be my preference because the 12th will be my first day at my new job, and it might be a little bit chaotic.
all right, is there any objection to the 13th of November at 1 o'clock?
No.
So without objection, let's go ahead and schedule that.
13th.
Yep. And Stephanie, as Ginger departs, will be helping the Secretary of State's office to do the communications on this, so she'll send out a reminder to everybody and notice calendaring.
So I was just wondering, since we have kind of a template for this from last time around, I mean, last time I think the listing went out maybe before we convened, or was it? Yeah. So since we're all here now, do we want to take a look at the listing and get that in motion? I mean, you could do that ahead of, I guess.
If we wanted to be efficient, we could do that, and we could also look at the questions that were asked last time. It just depends on whether or not we want to stretch those out into other meetings, or we want to deal with that now. Because we already have a template for this, like you said.
Yeah, my inclination is to wait because of the added focus on the office, the added kind of heat around the office. I just assume wait and have a full discussion about how we want to list it and how we want to put those qualifications in place. But in the meantime, Stephanie can give us all of the material from last time so that we'll have that available to look at.
And I suppose, to your point, that we may want to beef up this job description to make all these things clear.
That was my thought.
I seem to remember some of the questions were rough.
I remember them being rough, but for a different reason.
Not rough, not rough as in difficult questions to ask. I think those are good in interviews.
Articulate.
They were crafted in a way that maybe it could have been better, so yeah.
And maybe, you know what I can do in the meantime is I can get that list of questions and send it out to you so you can consider and we can discuss it.
Yeah, that would be good.
And so that it wasn't quorum last time, Mary Beth was the center for all question ideas, and then she would let folks comment on that, and send back individual comments to her,
Yes.
not as a group.
Yeah, be careful not to reply. I'll do the same thing. We'll have Stephanie, I or whoever the secretary designates. I suspect I'll probably be it.
I have a couple questions right now before we adjourn, if that's okay. This is Kim Thatcher.
Yeah, sure, that would be great.
Okay, one, and I guess I maybe direct this at Rob or whoever, but I just want to make double sure that with this legislative concept that we've constructed during this meeting, that if we end up going through the governor appointment process, I just want to make sure that the legislation, the rest of the legislation would still apply to this position, and that there's not some hidden statute somewhere that says, well, if the governor appoints, you know, this rule applies. So I just want to make sure on that. And then if and when the legislation, the legislative process does its meat grinding activities and it changes the bill, does the PrAC want to weigh in? Are they just going to weigh in through public testimony, or is there going to be some other trigger that says, nope, we got to pull the plug, this is not good? Or are you just going to decide that as we go along?
And Senator, this is Rob. That's a great question. Hadn't thought that far into it. Here's my instant reaction to it for what it's worth. I think whoever the requester is, whether it's committee counsel or whether it's you or whether it's Representative Power, I think we need to ask legislative counsel that rather than have me take a stab at it and scour through statutes. I think ask legislative counsel whether or not an advocate hired under existing statute, and assuming passage of this bill we've tentatively approved here, you know, at the council, whether that would change in the manner you talk about. I don't think it would. I think once you change the statute and make the advocate subject to the council and not the governor, I think that's perspective, and I think it applies to anyone in that position, but I could be wrong. And legislative counsel's opinion is the opinion that matters, but let's just assume they say there is an issue. That's easy to craft around, because in addition to the E clause, they would just add an operative clause to it that basically says the amendments to these two statutes by this 2020 bill apply to public records advocates hired on, before, or after the effective date of this act, and call it a day. So it's a one-line operability clause that we could add, but I wouldn't want to add it unless LC thought we had to. It's a long way of saying that.
So who will be asking questions?
Well, LC won't respond to us. They will respond to you because you're their client and we're not. So with the ask, whether it's from, I'm not sure, would it be Senate Government Council? Which committee on the Senate side would it be coming from? I guess that's my question. Would it be Senator Riley's committee?
Likely, yes.
Yeah, so either his staff or his committee, or you could ask, or maybe Senator Riley asks if it's going to be a committee bill. But somebody just needs to ask LC. One of LC's clients needs to ask LC.
I forget, Kim, are you on that committee?
I'm not, actually.
That's what I thought. Yeah, we don't want.
But Riley's only 2 doors down from me on the office, and we talk quite often. So.
Yeah, I think with the ask, because, and I just sent it to Ginger with notes. I mean, we're already going to ask 2 questions. One, craft a narrow relating to clause, and then I think we could also have that question asked. Do we need an operative clause to make it clear that the advocate hired under the old statute would be subject to the new statute, not the old one? I think it's just a basic question to ask and add an operative clause if necessary.
Well, I nominate Rob to go sit with legislative counsel and make sure we get the question asked correctly so that the answer.
Second.
But I need a note from, I need a note from Mother from somebody, because they won't talk to me without that.
I'm happy to provide one.
Thank you, Senator.
Any other thoughts, comments, questions?
To adjourn?
Do we have any comments from the public? Anyone on?
Yes, I have a comment.
Okay, go ahead.
This is Brittany Ruiz, and I just have a couple of things in light of some public records requests, and also being on this several committees. I have a suggestion where there needs to be actually a member of the public on the council. Unless I'm wrong, as far as I know, much every single member on this council benefits financially from the state of Oregon, except for maybe 2 reporters. So I just think there should be, how the selection process should include at least several people that are members of the actual public. And that's just a suggestion.
Okay, great. I do want to point out, so Tony, are you on the line? Tony is our member of the public. We also have 3 spots for reporters, 2 of which are occupied right now. One of them has resigned recently, but that spot will be filled again in the near future.
Yeah, hi, my name is Tony Hernandez. Feel free to email me at tony@oregon.gov, and I'd be happy to help out however I can.
Thanks, Tony.
Sure.
All right, anyone else on the line have a comment? Okay, then we will go ahead and adjourn. Do we have a motion to do so?
I did.
All right.
Second.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Anyone opposed? Anyone want to stick around in this meeting? All right. Well, we ended, I think, 45 minutes or more ahead of time. Yeah. All right, excellent job. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and drop the